Robert is 13, lying in bed with the door cracked open exactly 2 inches, listening for the change in his father's footsteps on the stairs. He has done this every night for as long as he can remember. 42 years later, Robert is 55, lying alone in his own bedroom. The door of that bedroom is shut for the first time in his life. The silence is unbearable. His body still doesn't believe it. This video is for the man who knows exactly why. This is for the man who has lived enough to recognize the question underneath. Not what pain did to you, how pain quietly refined the way wise men think and what it cost them to learn it. Today I want to walk you through 7 signs you will probably recognize before I am finished with the first. 1 cost most psychology videos refuse to name, and 1 frame from Carl Jung in 1931 that holds the whole thing together. Quick note: some details have been changed for privacy. Robert is drawn from patterns I have observed across many men I have known over the years. Sin 1 pain refined your reading of silence, not just noise. The first sign is the easiest to recognize. Pain did not just sharpen your reading of noise, it refined your reading of silence. Most men think hypervigilance is about catching threat. It is not. It is about catching the moment before threat. The pause, the breath that didn't come, the chair that scraped half a second too early. Robert at 13 knew that silence in his house meant his father was 3 drinks in. Silence meant the next moment mattered more than the last hour. He learned to listen for what was about to happen because nobody around him was going to warn him when it did. 40 years later, Robert can walk into any room and tell you exactly what is not being said. Other men leave a meeting feeling fine. Robert leaves knowing which 2 people are about to quit, which one is sleeping poorly, and which one is afraid of the man across from him. He almost never says any of this. He doesn't need to. He just knows. This is not intuition. It is 40 years of training in a craft nobody enrolled you in. And every man like Robert knows the truth. Nobody told him at 20 that this skill, the one everyone now praises in him, was paid for by a 13-year-old who never got to put it down. That is the first sign. It is the least costly. The second is where your body started keeping a ledger you never agreed to sign. Sign 2. Your body started keeping a ledger you didn't sign. There is a price for being the man who can read every room. The brain charged it to your body. In 1993, a neuroscientist at Rockefeller University named Bruce McEwen coined a term for what chronic vigilance does over decades. He called it allostatic load, the wear and tear that accumulates when the stress response is supposed to fire and return to baseline, but never quite returns. In his 1998 paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, McEwen documented what that load looks like in the body: impaired immunity, atherosclerosis, bone demineralization, atrophy of nerve cells in the brain itself. This is not metaphor. The system meant for short threats has been running for 40 years in your body. The bill arrives in your 50s. Lower back. Sleep that breaks apart at 4 in the morning. Blood pressure your doctor frowns at without quite explaining where it came from. Notice your shoulders right now. Where they are sitting, even watching this. Notice you are slightly forward in your chair. That is not your posture. That is your training. A 1,998 study at Kaiser Permanente followed 17,000 adults and found what the medical world has spent decades trying to absorb. Childhood adversity does not just leave marks on the psyche. It leaves them on the body, decades later. In disease patterns nobody can write off to lifestyle. This is the cost most psychology videos refuse to name. They tell you pain made your brain sharper. It also wore your body down. Both are true. Both worth honoring. Your body has been keeping the receipt the whole time. The third sign is what happens when the system that wore you down is the only system that knows how to operate during a crisis. Sin 3. Crisis became the only place you fully exhale. Here is the paradox most men like Robert live inside. The man wound tight in normal life is the calmest man in the room when everything actually falls apart. Researchers call this stress inoculation, like a vaccine in reverse. Your nervous system was calibrated by chaos when you were too young to remember the calibrating. Normal pressure now is just Thursday. Real pressure is where you actually live. Society called this dysfunction. Society was wrong. The men who hold a room together when the ceiling falls in are the men who learned to hold themselves together when they were too young to be holding anything at all. That is not damage. That is craft. I knew a surgeon once. Call him Arthur. 62 now. The day his career was made was the day a resident nicked an aorta. The room froze. Arthur did not. He tied off the bleeder. Hand steady. Voice steady. After, in the parking lot, He sat in his car for 40 minutes. The 8-year-old boy who had learned to manage his mother's air pressure was the man who saved that patient. Arthur knows this. He doesn't talk about it. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations in his tent at the front of the Marcomannic Wars. He was not a guru. He was a wounded emperor talking to himself. Book 5, Passage 20. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. That is not a line about resilience workshops. That is a man at the front of an empire telling his future self what wise men eventually learn. The obstacle is the path. The first 3 signs are about what pain did to you. The 4th is what they are doing to each other inside you right now. Sign 4 meta pivot. These 3 signs are doing something to you. Pause here. The first 3 signs were observations. This 4th one is the frame they sit inside. And it is going to flip the first 3 on their head. There are 2 halves of life. Most of us know this in our bones by 55. The morning of life is about building who you are. The afternoon is about questioning who you have been. Different work, different psychology. Most men who built their lives on hypervigilance, on reading silence, on holding it together discover at 50-something that the operating system that ran the morning is running the wrong house, still scanning rooms that no longer hold the threat, still anticipating footsteps that no longer come. Here is the cruel joke of it. You spent 40 years becoming exceptional at reading the room. Now you are the one in the room who needs the reading. Nobody else can do it. They never could. Carl Jung wrote this exact dynamic into an essay in 1931, The Stages of Life. His words slowly. We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. The question of the afternoon is not how to read the room. It is how to forgive the room for the work you had to do in it. And that is the question the second half of this video sits inside. Before we go in, one thing. If you have made it 7 minutes into this, you are the kind of man I make these for. Not the man looking for a 5-step fix, the kind who has lived enough to recognize the deeper question. Subscribe. A new one every week. Now the one sign I almost did not include in this, because it costs the most to admit. Sign 5. Your scanning gave them peace at the cost of yours. There is a sentence that thousands of men have already typed under videos like this one. It goes, you can read everyone else, but struggle to find peace within yourself. That is the most repeated sentence in this genre. It is exactly correct. Here is what nobody in the cluster has been willing to say. You have spent decades building a budget for outward scanning. You never built a corresponding budget for inward attention. The two are not the same currency, and one cannot be funded from the other. Society told you that being attuned to others is generosity. It is. But unreciprocated generosity is a long form of self-erasure. The room you have been reading has never offered to read you back. Robert understood this only at 55, 8 months after his divorce. He realized something. For 30 years, every dinner table he sat at, he had been doing for his wife and daughter what his 10-year-old self had done for his father, reading the room so they would not have to. Nobody asked. Nobody returned it. Nobody noticed. The work of the afternoon, then, is to build the second budget. Here is one practice from Marcus Aurelius's evening discipline. Before sleep, 3 questions. What did I read in others today that they did not see in me? What did I refuse to read in myself? What part of the inner room have I not entered all year? That is the sign that costs the most to admit. The 6th is what wise men do once they admit it. Sign 6. You started measuring meaning by what you build for others. In 2014, 4 researchers published a finding from the Harvard Study of Adult Development, a project that has followed the same group of men for over 70 years. Published in the Journals of Gerontology by Landes, Ardelt, Vaillant, and Waldinger. The finding was specific. For men who had experienced an adverse childhood, one variable mediated whether they aged well or aged badly. It was generativity in midlife, the capacity to invest in something that will outlast you. Erik Erikson called this the 7th stage, generativity versus stagnation. Roughly 40 to 65, the men who make it through the difficult morning of life are the men who, by their 50s, find something to build that is not for them. Edward is 54. Served as a Marine in the Gulf, 1991. Lost his only son Caleb to an overdose 6 years ago. By every measure, this is a man who should be unreachable. He teaches woodworking at a community college outside Charlottesville now, 3 nights a week, to kids whose fathers never showed them how to hold a chisel. Edward will tell you he is just keeping busy. He is not. He is doing what the Harvard study said a man like him has to do to make it intact to 70. Wise men do not become generous because the wound finally closed. They become generous because they understood early what was missing. The afternoon of life is where you stop carrying that absence and start filling it for someone else. That brings us to the last sign, the slowest and the truest. SIGN. 7. Pain didn't end it metabolized into something you can pass on. Pain is not something you finish. Pain is something that metabolizes slowly, over decades, into a different element. Viktor Frankl was a Viennese psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz. In 1984, he wrote a postscript to man's search for meaning, called The Case for a Tragic Optimism. In it, he named what he called the tragic triad: pain, guilt, death. He said the human task is not to avoid these. They cannot be avoided. The task is what he called tragic optimism, the capacity to find meaning despite, and sometimes because of, the unavoidable. He described 3 paths to that meaning: something you create, something you encounter, including love, and the attitude you take towards suffering you cannot remove. Most men in their 50s have already been walking path 3 for decades without naming it, quietly, in how they spoke to their children, in what they refused to pass on, in the joke they did not make. Research on post-traumatic growth, the field developed by Tedeschi and Calhoun in the 90s, confirms that real growth from adversity unfolds over decades, not weeks. The promise on TikTok of unlocking some 7-day intelligence is a lie. Real growth is slow geology, not fast weather. Wise men know this. They know they did not survive what they survived in order to know more. They survived in order to give what they wished someone had given them. Before I close, one thing I want to be honest about. I want to say this clearly. Nothing in this video undoes what happened. Nothing makes the morning of your life worth it in some accounting where the books finally balance. Frankl did not say pain made meaning. He said meaning can be found even where pain refused to make sense. Those are different sentences. The first is what self-help sells. The second is what wise men know. Nothing in this video is a clinical diagnosis. If anything here resonates with prolonged distress that feels heavier than a video can hold, please reach out to a licensed therapist or a trusted advisor where you are. 2 practices then. The first comes from Jung. 5 minutes a day on paper. 2 columns. Left: what others needed from me today. Right: what I needed from me today. Most days for 30 years, the right column has been empty. The work of the afternoon is to fill it. The second is Frankl's. 1 question. What would the man I am building have to become for this to mean something 40 years from now? Ask it once a week. Do not answer it quickly. Look, for most of your life you have been told that what happened early did damage. It did. But that was not all it did. The way you read silence. The way you stay still when other men panic. The way you have never quite been able to take meaning for granted. None of that is malfunction. None of that is wreckage you are still carrying. It is the architecture of a man who paid tuition his peers never had to pay and who now teaches free every time he walks into a room. You are not the problem. You are the proof that the morning's wound, in the right years, becomes the afternoon's compass. Hold that. Both of it. The sharpness was real. So was the cost. Wise men do not pretend otherwise. If anything here found you tonight, subscribe. The next one of these arrives next week. In the comments, tell me which of the 7 landed hardest. Just the number 1 through 7. I read every single one. And honestly, that is where I learn the most. On the screen now, 2 videos that pick up where this one ends. The first is for the man who wants to think more about what being alone actually means. The second is the one most men have started with. Pick whichever speaks to you. Until next time.